All right. Go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for joining, everyone. My name's Colleen. I'm part of the Battery programming team, and I'm really excited about tonight's talk. We are partnering with Sava, Televotes, and the Equity Organization to talk about cannabis in the 2020 election. It's my pleasure to introduce Andrea Brooks. Andrea is a cannabis advocate, lobbyist for social change, and entrepreneur with a passion for health and wellness. Following an injury in which cannabis played a crucial role in her recovery, she was inspired to advocate for the plant and build solutions in the space. She founded Sava in 2014, and she enjoys leveraging her previous career in human and social services to build strategic industry relationships and create a thriving Sava community. We're really proud to be longtime partners with Sava. We've done a lot of cannabis-related programming with them, and this is a topic that's especially important, especially now as we head into an election in just a few months. So, Andrea, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So, again, this is about cannabis activism in the 2020 election, and the reason we think it's so important to be having this conversation is that here we all enjoy the privilege of buying and selling and consuming cannabis products without any consequence. And while we have these privileges, there are still people suffering severe consequences from doing the same thing, and disproportionately Black and brown people. So as cannabis enthusiasts, we believe we have a responsibility to engage in activism around remedying this. And as Colleen introduced me, I'm the CEO of Sava. Many years ago, I had a disabling injury, and then cannabis was a catalyst for healing, and it was a complete game changer for me. As such, I created Sava, which is an online curated cannabis marketplace, and we deliver throughout the larger Bay Area. Being that I had such an emotional tie to cannabis and what it did for me, Sava from the beginning has been mission-based. And those missions and values have continued to evolve over time. From the beginning, we wanted to support legacy and artisanal brands, make sure that 50% of the brands on our platform are women-owned. And as we evolve over time, we are focused on deepening our commitment to social equity and having it be woven into the fabric of Sava. So, we are committed to helping end systemic racism in our society, as well as inequity in the cannabis industry. From Sava's perspective, over the past few months, we've been developing increasing initiatives that combine both long-term and short-term efforts, which include making sure we're actively giving back and supporting expungement efforts, as well as Black and brown communities that have been disproportionately affected by the war on drugs, making sure that we're mentoring, and making sure that we're providing shelf equity for Black and brown owned brands. So we want to make sure that we are going beyond any performative action to support ongoing and lasting change. And a critical part of that is education and making sure that we're supporting the initiatives of organizations that are really on the ground doing the hard work. So I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. First, we have Megan Zori, who's the COO and co-founder of Sava, as well as our general counsel. Megan views trust built through education, consistency, and compliance as a tool for reducing the lingering social barriers associated with responsible cannabis use. Megan leverages her legal background to navigate the ever-changing patchwork of laws and regulations to lead Sava's cannabis operations and serve as general counsel. Next, we have Alexis Cruz, who is a political consultant and member of Televotes. Alexis is a political strategist and social entrepreneur committed to promoting equity and inclusion worldwide. Her political career began as a field organizer for President Obama's re-election campaign in Colorado. She served in the US Senate, working for US Senator Michael Bennet, focusing on healthcare, criminal justice reform, and policing in Colorado, before moving into fundraising for African-American candidates with the Collective PAC. Notably, Alexis worked at Columbia University's Institute for Human Rights and served as a research analyst at the United States Institute of Peace, where her work focused on countering violent extremism in fragile states. Alexis is a graduate of Spelman College and New York University, where she got her master's, and currently resides in San Francisco working at Facebook. And we also have Natalie Papillon, the founder and executive director of Equity Organization. Natalie is the founder and executive director of the Equity Organization, a non-for-profit organization working to advance just, effective, and equitable criminal justice and drug policy related reforms. Prior to founding the Equity Organization, Natalie worked in various strategy, marketing, and operations leadership roles at several large technology firms, including Google, Rent the Runway, and the Future of Storytelling. Natalie has also worked as a writer, researcher, and curator for both academic and mass market publications, including Jim Crow Freedom, Memory and Identity in Black America since 1940. Natalie is also the author of a forthcoming Reefer Madness, The Roots of Marijuana Prohibition in America, a history of America's early approach to drug policy. Natalie is a graduate of Yale University. So thank you to our panelists. So we're gonna have a panel discussion, and then from those that are, we wanna open it up for Q&A. I would encourage, anyone listening to just throw out the questions as they come to you, and we'll collect them and make sure that we address them. And to kick it off, let me see where I'm gonna kick it off. I kind of wanna just start with, how can we get nonviolent offenders out of prison, especially those in there for cannabis-related offenses? So, Alexis, maybe I'll kick it off with you. Oh, Alexis, we can't hear you. We'll get there 1 minute. There we go. Got you. Okay.
Like my AirPods have been working or not working over the past week in technology.
Yeah.
So I think the biggest issue right here is that we have people who are still in prison for misdemeanors, for things that, as you noted earlier, that we enjoy in our day-to-day lives. We need to look at lowering sentencing. We need to look at making sure these people get appropriate legal counsel, and also working with local authorities to actually, I want to say, either lessen the terms of the sentencing, but also work to expunge their records, right? And so like part of the problem is that they're in prison, but the other part, or in jail, the other part is once they get released, this is on their record, right? When they are applying for jobs, this is on their record. Something as little as having an 8th possession of marijuana, right? And that's truly criminal. So I think, yes, it's getting them out, but also making sure that they are set up for success once they actually leave the prison system, because that's where we find repeat offenders end up back into the prison system when they don't have those opportunities because of the stigma attached to being within the system, but especially for something as menial as marijuana possession. So that's my thought on it.
Yeah, Natalie, do you have anything to add to that? And we started with how can we get nonviolent offenders with cannabis-related offenses out of prison?
Yeah, I think they're sort of the what can we do right now, and then how can we reform the system so we're ensuring that more people do not get sort of caught up in this carceral state. I think for right now, and this depends on the jurisdiction you're in, it depends on sort of local and state, even federal level, if those are federal charges, but they're, executives, so whether the White House or governor's office have the power to issue clemency motions, and so that allows people who are currently incarcerated to be released. And unfortunately, in most jurisdictions, that process is quite opaque. But I think with the right amount of media attention and the right amount of sort of strategic partners, especially if a sentence is particularly egregious or if it's in a jurisdiction that has legalized those, we've seen more and more positive results coming from clemency petitions. Given sort of the pandemic raging, we can also work to file compassionate release motions, especially for those who are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19 in prison. And this is for people who have cannabis charges and are, incarcerated on those charges, or others, like these are not cannabis specific initiatives. So those are a few of the tools we have in our toolbox to sort of release people currently incarcerated. But I think if we're to think about, how can we make sure that people are not re-entered into the system, we have to think about every sort of touch point in the criminal legal system, from that initial police encounter, which may not, you may be arrested, it may be a citation, potentially it's sort of a temporary hold in a jail, or maybe it escalates to an arrest in a local or state or federal prison, to sort of when you get in front of a judge, if you do, we need to think about prosecutorial power and sort of how our prosecutors are incentivized to treat a lot of these charges. And then we also need to think about alternatives to incarceration, even for people who may have charges that we consider to be violent versus nonviolent. One of the things people will tell you is, nonviolent, people should definitely get out if there's a violent crime attached to their record, and they absolutely shouldn't. You'd be surprised what is considered a quote unquote violent charge in our criminal legal system. I was just working on the case of a man who is incarcerated for 40 years for selling around 3 pounds of pot in the 70s or 80s. And it's considered a violent offense because he had guns at his home, which was nowhere close to where he was caught selling, but because he had a previous record and a gun was on his property, that now he's a violent, quote unquote, violent offender. So we need to make sure we're like very, very conscientious of the way we use labels and the way we understand the sort of different cases that we come across, because sometimes they're quite misleading.
Well, and what are some of the blockers for getting the people that are, I know you touched on it a little bit, but just kind of what are the blockers for getting people who are incarcerated released and their records expunged?
There are some that are philosophical, and then there's some that are procedural. So unfortunately, the way our criminal legal system works, it's quite disparate. It's like quite Byzantine, and a lot of people are still using paper records. It's really hard to sort of get different people talking to each other. So just in order to coordinate something like a clemency sort of petition or motion, it can take forever and ever, and months and months and months. So you have all of those issues, and I think that's why we need to pressure our elected officials to make sure that we're using modern technology, and we're also being timely when it comes to a lot of this. And then philosophically, I do think there is a real fear, especially on the part of elected officials, that you release someone who's incarcerated and they're somehow connected to a crime, and it gets in the news, and that crime is pinned on you. So I think there's a real fear on, rightly or wrongly, in sort of the political arena around any acts of mercy or compassionate release. And I think we need to assuage their fears by demanding these policies because they work for us, right? And we also need to make sure that we look at the entire breadth of the system and not the 1 or 2 stories that may be very sensational but don't represent the actual experience of people who are released from our criminal justice system.
Yeah, Alexis, Megan, to add on.
Oh, you're muted.
Oh, we'll get there.
I was just going to touch on what Natalie said a minute ago, which is that I think a more expansive view of reducing the prison population and not just singling in on nonviolent offenders is the right approach. If we think about the prisons, like the concept of prison and taking someone out of society who we've deemed to be a threat. There's a point in time where the threat is neutralized and that person can be released regardless of whether the original offense was violent or non-violent. So I mean, I think, you know, certainly like the time of the offense and the age of the offender and the sentence length would go into some of those considerations about whether or not like even a violent offender could be released early. I also think that COVID has been really interesting. Since, you know, between March and June of this year, there was about an 8% decrease in the US prison population. And when I first read that, I was like, oh, of course, we're releasing all these people from prison. But I guess actually what it is about ways that, you know, other aspects of the system shifted. And so there's two ways that we can reduce the prison population. One is by reducing admissions, and the other is increasing releases. And what actually happened was there was a large reduction in the number of admissions because prisons stopped accepting new prisoners from jails in order to avoid, you know, importing the virus from the jail into the prison. Courts also closed, so people didn't get sentences. And then fewer people were targeted or I guess cited as harshly for parole violations or probation violations. And so those are lessons that I think that we can take into this in going forward in terms of how we can like have these small tweaks to the system that might have a larger impact overall. You know, we can look for changes in the way that parole decisions are made and infractions. You know, a lot of people end up going to prison for an infraction that they made while they were on parole, that if they weren't on parole, nobody would care about it. It'd be completely legal. Like smoking cannabis in a state that legalizes it and wouldn't care otherwise. I think, you know, in terms of increasing prisoner release, and Natalie talked a little bit about the bureaucracy and how confusing it is, changing some of the patterns that are in place right now to make it more efficient and more clear. You know, you could increase the number of review processes for parole. You could try to speed up the time in between, you know, hearings and decrease delays. You could also change the formulas in certain states for crediting, providing good time credits. You know, that those processes differ by state and they can be really confusing in terms of like how much good time credit is given for certain things. So I think looking at those little small actions that like if enough of those are taken, combined to create a bigger, more impactful system might be one way to go about doing it.
Alexis, anything else to add in there?
No, honestly, I think Megan and Natalie did such an amazing job in uncoupling and also distilling the actual issues at hand for this population and what actually needs to be done, and also the roadblocks, right? And part of it is our politicians who should be held accountable to us, but that doesn't happen, right? And we look at the Department of Justices, we look at attorney generals, statewide, California, for example. So it's so nuanced, and that's not just like a easy black and white answer. So I think Megan and Natalie did an amazing job in distilling it.
I think what Natalie was saying too about no one wants to be the politician that lets someone out of, you know, prison that then goes and commits another murder or does something terrible. Nobody wants to be that person. And the media will pick up on that and run that. But what the media won't run is the like hundreds of thousands of other people that because of that risk aversion, their families are torn apart and their lives are like on hold. It's not as easy of a story to tell, and it's not as, you know, it's not a soundbite in the same way that like a salacious murder is. And so I think that's another point that Natalie brought up that was really important.
Well, you know, and kind of just digging in a little bit more, Megan, I'm going to keep the mic on you for a minute. When, you know, digging a little more into criminal justice reform, you know, what are some other underlying issues in the criminal justice system that you know, see that need to be addressed?
It's such a broad question. And it is so interdependent in so many other systems that, you know, when I think about this, I really think about it from the context of small as all, because it feels so overwhelming to think of like, how can we fix criminal justice reform? So I try to think of like, What are these little tiny meaningful things that you can do to just nudge in the direction of where you want criminal justice to go? And one of the things that, just from my background, that I'm more familiar with is like on the IT side. And I don't know if a lot of people realize how much like algorithms and IT go into the outcomes of court cases. So a lot of times, like when people are trying to figure out, you know, whether to let someone out of prison, you know, they'll rely on an algorithm. Usually, oftentimes it's a system called Compass that will spit out a likelihood of recidivism. And so I think there's a misconception that we like to believe that if a computer says it's true, then it must be unbiased and it must be true, because computers don't have bias. But we fail to think about like the people that actually created those algorithms, and that they innately like impact those, you know, algorithms with their own personal biases and put their biases in there. So I think there's two ways that this is problematic. One is in the development of the algorithm itself. What factors are they considering? And it might not be that they're factoring, let's say, race explicitly, but they could be factoring things that are proxies for race. You know, even someone's address could, you know, theoretically like tell you about like some aspect of the person that you're not necessarily intending. And without understanding the implications of that, you've now programmed a certain bias into this algorithm that on scale is going to massively affect a population unintentionally. And then the other area that I see this happening is with the training of those algorithms. Maybe you've crafted a perfectly unbiased algorithm. I don't think that's possible, but let's say that you did. You know, the data that you then feed into that algorithm to train it on what's correct and what's not in terms of its predictive abilities, if that information is biased or if that information is garbage, you're going to have a garbage in, garbage out situation that's made even more dangerous by the fact that people think that it's completely unbiased and fair. So I think like in that context, the small step forward that you take is increasing diversity within IT departments, which doesn't seem like, you know, when we're talking about criminal justice, that would be like the obvious thing to do. But, you know, as law enforcement tries to continue to get around the Fourth Amendment by using, you know, Nest cameras from private individuals, or using Compass, which is a private, you know, development firm, and we don't have any insight into what their algorithms even do, or what, you know, how they work and what the reliability is. We don't have any way to test that. Making sure that the people that design those systems, the teams that design those systems, have a diversity of thought going into the impacts of those systems would be one small step forward in impacting criminal justice in a large way.
I love that. I love that IT and algorithm perspective, because I don't think that's something, you know, there's so many different pieces of this that we need to be thinking about holistically. And I think that's, you know, a critical piece. Natalie, I guess same question, or iterating on it in terms of underlying issues in the criminal justice system that we all need to be paying attention to, no matter, you know, what state, what county we're living in.
Well, there's so many, but what Megan said is so true. Small is all. We're not going to solve this issue in one fell swoop. And a lot of the issues that have been really have had an outsized impact on the scale of the carceral state are actually not very sexy. I mean, there are things like IT and processes, and, you know, I volunteer with this group called the Dollar Bail Brigade, and every couple of weeks we go down and I bring literally $1 bill and bail someone out of jail with that dollar for, you know, I don't know the person, I sort of get that name, and you're curious, like, why can't the person pay the dollar? Why is someone being held on $1 bail? And it's because the actual like computer systems, and I use computer very loosely, are configured in a way that you can't put a zero, like you can't not put a dollar amount to that person's case. So it has to be that dollar. And if their family or friend is at work or whatnot, you can sit in jail for a couple of days for $1. It's a physical dollar. So a lot of these really, really small, and I'm not the only one doing it. It's a huge organization, and I live in New York City. It's a huge organization that's doing that. So you'd be surprised at how minute and how just like boring a lot of these issues are, but they are having incredibly outsized impacts. I also think one of the things that I've been very passionate about recently that sometimes doesn't get sort of nested into the decarceration movement is, we need to empty, help start to empty a lot of our jails and prisons right now. But we really have to make sure that we're not sending, we're not emptying them only to refill them over and over again. And I often see, and maybe I'm on Twitter too much or I pay too much attention to the news, but I often see when anyone does something wrong or doesn't feel up to our sort of like moral or ethical standards of the day, we were like, we need to create a law around that, like someone does something bad and we publicly shame them, and then 3 sort of state senators swoop in and say, we're going to criminalize this behavior instead of, allowing people to just know you shouldn't do it. And and a lot of times that is very well intentioned. It comes from a great place. But the American criminal justice system is like a one-way ratchet. It only turns one way. You never get rid of laws. I mean, can't ever. I mean, cannabis being, maybe one of the examples. So we have to think about every time we add something new, you're never going to take that off. And it's just going to make it harder and harder for people to like have freedom of movement and freedom of association. Like, not everything needs to be governed by the legal system. And other countries have been able to do very well without, sort of reflexively looking to punitive sort of responses. And so that, I think we just need a philosophical change in the way the public thinks, because a lot of times politicians are doing this because that's what their constituents are calling for. And then the way sort of policymakers think and conceptualize safety and public health, because incarceration is not that.
I love that you mentioned just, noting the fact that cannabis laws have been an exception to making some changes in the law. There's financial incentives for cities and states to do that in a way that there may not be the same financial incentive out of the gate, or real long-term holistic thinking when people are approaching it. And there's that short-term gain to legalizing cannabis, again, in terms of financial impact, which I think has been a huge driving force in changing the laws. Alexis, anything else to comment, and just kind of, what do you think we should be paying attention to in terms of, key positions and ballot measures?
Right. So I think Natalie touched on something that was really interesting in terms of how we look at the legal system and understanding that other countries actually choose to do some type of like community policing, which is focused on soft power. And the way that our laws have been written, even the way our Constitution is written, it focuses on hard power. It focuses on putting people in prison, using military force, making people pay X, Y, and Z fines for, and we have seen over and over again that doesn't work, right? But we do have examples in other countries where we have US agencies like the State Department investing time and energy teaching populations about how to be compassionate, about how to do community policing, how to create programs that actually address issues instead of sending someone to prison. And that helps with the repeat offender. That helps with making sure that people actually have a pathway once they leave the prison system, or they actually have an opportunity to avoid being arrested in the first place. So I think that's really important, because what we're seeing right now is a doubling down on that type of ethos, and it's creating something that is so disheartening to see, especially since most of the people who are being arrested, especially for cannabis, are people of color, right? And so it just feeds into like a larger system when we think about social justice, the bigger umbrella, and health disparities, education disparities, housing disparities. And so if we start to change our ethos as a nation, I think we could get there, but it starts with politicians, right? It starts with ballot measures. I think there's a ballot measure in California, Prop 17, that changes the way that we allow felons to actually vote. It's 2020. Why do we have to have this in a place like California? Why are there only 28 states that actually have decent laws as it relates to incarcerated people being able to actually vote, right? So in California currently, if you are in a county jail, for example, or on probation, you have the opportunity to vote. And if you are currently in prison in the state or federal prison, you don't have that opportunity. So how many of these people don't even get a chance to exercise their rights as US citizens to vote and participate in this process? And every law impacts them, right? And so that's something that's, on the ballot this year in California. That's something that we should definitely look at, something that we should support as we're talking about criminal justice reform. But then Megan also touched on IT. I work on voter suppression on Facebook, and one of our biggest issues is our algorithms and making sure that they are actually catching things that are related to voter suppression and training our engineers and the people who work with them to create these data sets, et cetera, to not be biased, but also to widen their expertise in terms of like, what is voter suppression? What does it mean to be LGBT in America? What does it mean to be like Black or Hispanic? They don't have that context. No one's taken the time to train them, because I think this is the first time that people are even realizing that computers aren't always right. And it's a human error, and we have to fix it. So I think definitely as we're thinking about the criminal justice system, it's also something that we're thinking about in the tech world too. And we're trying to like figure out ways to kind of change the way our AI is working. And as it relates to 2020 and voting, this is something that we can't afford to mess up. But I think moving forward, we can take lessons learned from tech companies and apply them to criminal justice systems and these court systems. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of gradual steps that you can take. But Natalie and Megan both hit on points that are quite unorthodox when we're having conversations about cannabis or just having conversations about incarcerated individuals as well.
I love that, because I think, as people become more educated and understand the devastating impact of a lot of policies and laws, then what happens next is, how do I create change? How can I impact change? And it can be so overwhelming, right? Distilling the right information and also just feeling that someone can make a change. So I love this approach of what's being done, and and that you're leading the charge there of addressing some of these algorithms and the way tech needs to be leveraged to provide benefit. Megan, do you have any other ideas of, what can we be doing to impact change within the system?
I mean, in terms of restoration of voting rights and changing that, I think education, a lot of education, and a reframing of like what voting rights are. So, I mean, I think it should be a human right to have input in the determination of your outcome. And there's other inalienable rights that we all agree on. Like you can't sell your freedom of speech. Like it's not a commodity. And I think voting rights should be similar. And there's, some ways when by virtue of your situation, you lose aspects of those rights, right? I think, you can understand that if you're going to prison, you're probably going to lose some of your freedom of speech. You're going to lose some of your like right to privacy. And that's understandable to a certain degree because of the context that you're in and the necessity of it. But what's the benefit or the purpose of losing your voting right? It doesn't necessarily it's not like because you're sharing a cell with someone that like you can't cast a vote. I can understand how you could lose privacy because of that. And so I think we really need to think about like, why do we not allow people to vote even when they are incarcerated? And what's the purpose of that? Why do we keep driving that? And is it a matter of dehumanizing them? And if that really is the underlying purpose, why? I think we need to really connect with our humanity and like have some education around the appreciation of the humanness of people who even make mistakes, because we all make mistakes.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I think two things that Megan touched on. One, it's people who make mistakes, and it's not just people who make mistakes, it's people who get caught making mistakes.
Yes.
So I think there's like a real misconception that I often even fall into, that people who are in prison or jail are criminals and they deserve to be there. And, you know, in some ways you could say yes, but I think there's this inability for people to realize that we commit criminal, quote unquote, criminal acts all the time. Like if you are consuming cannabis, even if you're in California, you are breaking a federal law every single time you do it. Like every single time. If you're selling it, if the federal government wanted to come in and arrest you and throw you in federal prison, they are totally within their rights to do that at this moment. Hopefully not for too much longer, but at this moment. And so I think there's this way of othering, like, oh, these are criminals. They need, when they just happen to get caught for reasons that often have to do with their skin color or their socioeconomic position, or even just like the simple geography of it and the way sort of the discriminatory policing practices play out. And so we need to stop, you know, like acting a little holier than thou, especially with a lot of these like low level social disorder violations. So that's one thing I often think about. You know, 51% of the American public has consumed cannabis. So that's 150 million people, you know, give or take, because, you know, think about over 18. That means there are 150 million criminals, federal criminals in this country. And I can guarantee you there are not 150 million Americans who consider themselves to be criminals. So we need to really, really like sort of, and I do this all the time, like, you know, take a step back and evaluate ourselves before judging others. You know, like let's not cast, I'm in a glass house right now and I cannot remember this idiom for like for the life of me. So that's really important. And then I also, to go back to what Megan was talking about, like why are we taking away voting rights? Of course, there's this dehumanization, this othering that happens. And I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I promise you I'm not. There's like also a real political play when it comes to a lot of the ways we talk about voting and voting rights for people incarcerated. So in most jurisdictions, and I live in New York, so I can say for New York, if you have like a very, very large jail or, you know, prison rather in your county, anyone who is currently incarcerated counts as the part of the population of that district, right? So when it comes to weighing the amount of representation you get, let's say in a state senate or a legislature, the people who are incarcerated in that particular geography count for that. So, but they are not able to vote for their elected, quote unquote, elected representatives. So people, so it's just like, not only are you taking away this right, it's a sort of taxation without representation for, but you know, but when we're thinking about voting rights, and so you're actually having people who live in counties in which the primary economic vehicle is a prison are actually benefiting not from just the economic activity of the prison, but also because they have disproportionate share in a state or local government because of that population that's also disenfranchised. So there's a real, and you know, in most states, and I can see for New York, you have all of the prisons are upstate in quite, you know, relatively rural, almost exclusively white towns. And the vast majority of state prisoners are from downstate, and they're disproportionately Black and brown. So you have this also interesting racial, rural, urban dynamic. And New York's a pretty liberal state, but what we see a lot is we have a lot of antagonism towards allowing for incarcerated people to vote, because we know that certain political parties would see their representation on the state level go down pretty significantly if that were to happen. So there's a ton of nefarious stuff behind it, but there's also a real political strategy that we need to shed light on and work to unpack for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Go, Megan.
I was just going to say, to tag on to what Natalie was saying, that like, you know, there's a lot of people in prison for things that we wouldn't necessarily consider criminal. And, you know, as I was saying, like, we have to reconnect with the human side of this. And I'm realizing that like, that's true even for myself as I'm sitting here speaking, you know, like it's so ingrained in our culture to other people who are in prison. And even as I'm sitting here talking about it, I'm referring to them as offenders, as though there's something that's not human, not just a human who happens to be in a prison. And so I think there's like a, you know, in the small is all context, like a continuing self-awareness and like a personal interest in trying to, you know, deprogram that line of thinking that is just so enmeshed in our like society that you don't always even realize that you're doing it, even when you have every intention in the opposite.
Yeah, I think I love that you bring that up, because again, this programming runs really deep. I don't think it's Natalie, anything related to conspiracy theories. This is the world we're living in, and this is the structure. And this is also what we're talking about, you know, how do we address this to have a more just society? I'm going to open it up to any questions in a minute, but Alexis, just wanted to see if you had anything to add on. I have plenty more questions. I know it's hours.
Honestly, we can move to questions because I can talk about othering and dehumanization all day. So no, we can definitely move on to questions because it starts with a change of ethos, and until that happens, and how we look at communities of color, communities who are in prison, nothing's going to change. It doesn't matter what like our systems look like. So I think we're good for questions.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to throw out to our panelists? Because I still have more questions. Oh, June, I see you.
I think Gary's trying to ask a question, but he's on mute.
There we go.
There you go.
So I think you guys have all raised a lot of really important valid points. Everything on down to from the algorithms in the system that's helping you determine whether they're going to return back, a probability of returning back to prison, to changing the outlook of our general population, not just the politicians, but the general population, about their willingness to see ex-felons, for example, coming back within the community. One of the things that I think is really important, and you guys brought this up related to clemency and the need to become probably bigger and better and more frequent champions of clemency for those that are incarcerated today on crimes that really shouldn't be punishable today under today's law in some states such as California. But I think what's important is there has to be a transition strategy in place to help those people that come out of prison and be able to develop the job skills in the workplace that's going to help them find value, find meaning, find purpose in their life as they make that transition back into society. And I want to just open it up to you guys. What are your thoughts on how best you think we could approach that as a nation and how we can help people transition so that we're reducing the probability of them being returned to prison for behaviors that are outside of the law. And so I want to get your thoughts on that.
I'll take a stab. So a lot of this work is already happening on the local level. I used to live in Denver, and I can give you a list of organizations that focus on transitions and focus on actually getting people the job skills, helping them get their GEDs, helping them get acclimated into the community again. But those programs are funded by grants. Those programs are also funded by generous donors, but in large part, they're not funded by the federal government. And that's what needs to happen. The money needs to come in from the federal government to ensure that we have this type of programming across the United States, because there are so many stories of people who have gone through transition programs, who have stayed out of prison, who end up creating, like running businesses or creating like similar programs for their own communities. But like Megan said earlier, it's not sexy. It's not something the news cycles, like the media wants to pick up. And so, you know, it's not getting the coverage that it needs, but it's also not getting the funding that it needs. And we also need more politicians to actually focus on these issues. They are a part of their population, right? This is something that benefits their community. This is something that when they talk about violence in the community, when they talk about education rates, when they talk about jobless rates, they are talking about these people. These programs are designed to lower those numbers and create better outcomes for everyone involved. And so we really need to find politicians who support this, who are willing to ask for funding on the federal and state and local levels. But we also need to be able to hold them accountable. And that starts with voting, but that also starts with making our voices heard and making this a real issue, because unless, you know, our elected officials know that we actually care about these individuals, they're going to continue to do the same thing. So there are so many great examples of programs out there, but they're not properly funded. And it comes down to funding at the end of the day, because there's an appetite for it and there are people doing it. I'm sure Megan and Natalie
I think earlier it was also brought up that the fear for the politicians of championing clemency and releasing a prisoner that then commits a serious crime, right? And so that can be a lot of risk from them from a political power perspective, right? So I think one of the things that may be beneficial is to really work with the local media and be able to champion and showcase within the community and throughout our nation through media the success stories of those folks that make the transition out, that gain clemency, that are released, go through a transitionary development program, and then are become success stories and then can be mentors to others going forward. I think we need to leverage the media in that fashion to tell that story versus focus on the rare instance when there's another violent act that's committed by a prisoner that was released. I think we need to develop those partnerships at the local level. And then as those gain momentum locally, then they're picked up on a national level, and that can get the word out of the success rate. And then I think that'll improve over time politicians' willingness to champion additional funding for these types of programs.
Yeah, Gary, that's a really great point. I think one of the things that I admit I love to do is we love to critique our elected officials. It's like my second time, you know, I'm on Twitter a lot, I told you, but we also need to reward them and congratulate them and like champion them when they're doing the right thing. I think oftentimes we only see the criticism and we never see the steps that people or elected officials are taking to right a lot of these wrongs. So we need to support our representatives when they do so. I think what Alexis said about federal funding is so key. You know, we spend billions and billions of dollars like extraordinary amounts of money, and you know, a minute amount of it is devoted to reentry programming. And we need to make sure that people are empowered to continue to do that work, especially on the local level. And so I agree with allocating more and more of those huge budgets to reentry programming. We also, to what Megan was speaking to earlier, we really need to reevaluate parole and probation. Like that is the non-carceral penal options that we think of as being alternatives. And so we like to use them more and more, and they've dramatically expanded since the war on drugs. You know, that you can almost trace those directly. Yeah, they seem nice, just like drug courts seem nice. But a lot of times they actually get people in more, pardon my French, more shit than they would have been in otherwise, right? So we need to like think about what is the real purpose of these non-carceral penal options. Are they successful? Generally, they are not. And how do we sort of revamp that whole like shadow criminal justice system? Because that's also the, you know, impetus for 30 to 40% of reoffending is parole violations, you know, or probation violations. That's huge. And then to the last thing, and I'll stop talking, but the theme of this evening seems to be like small is all. They have, you know, very, very intelligent scholars have done a lot of work. And what happens in your first 24 hours after you're released from prison determines your entire trajectory. And they have calculated it down to the dollar. If you can give someone $109, now adjust it for the cost of living in whatever state, but you you dramatically change the chances that that person does not immediately sort of get picked back up. And most people are literally, it's like the one time Hollywood gets it right, dropped at the front door with like a bag of their clothes and no money, maybe bus fare. How are they even going to get home, you know, if they don't have someone picking you up? So we need to think about even at $100, when you consider it costs, you know, $100,000 a year to keep someone incarcerated in many states, like that could change outcomes in such a huge way. So not sexy, but potentially quite impactful.
I muted myself. I know we're starting to bump against time, but you know, really just what I'd like to kind of close out with, and this ties to some of the chats going on, is, you know, what are some call to actions that we can do to help this? I shared a couple voter guides, you know, and I think, you know, I'm interested in like what, you know, adopt a state initiatives like that. What are some call to actions that people can engage with? And I think, you know, some of the reason we've been talking about things beyond California is I think most of us have community outside the state that we can be talking to about these important initiatives. We're all focusing on, you know, the swing states with regards to the election. So I'd love to hear, maybe Alexis, I'll start with you in terms of call to actions that you think are critical.
There are so many. So I would focus on two. One is definitely focusing on the swing states. I just dropped a list including Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, right? States that we really don't hear about but are currently on the news. I would focus on supporting organizations that are on the ground there doing this work already. They need to be funded. They need support. If you have someone who lives in that state, see if they can actually volunteer, see if you can do virtual phone banking. The way that canvassing is happening now for these campaigns, local and national, has changed because of COVID. And so there are so many ways to actually get involved, but I think the biggest thing that we could do right now is to adopt a state that is a key state within this election, but B, actually have conversations with people about what's on the ballot. Most states send out guides, voting guides, a few weeks before early voting starts. I think everyone who's like represented here, right? Like New York, California, Colorado, for example, we're doing mail-in ballots. When you're registered to vote in California, for example, you will automatically get a mail-in ballot. That also comes with a book. Actually, California's guidebook is already online. It starts with going through and understanding the propositions and having conversations with your friends and having them have conversations. Those are things that like we need to do right now. Those are things that can happen right now, and they're very easy things to do. Those would be my two. There are so many other, but like for big impact, those would be my two.
Natalie, I'm gonna throw this question also your way, and then Megan, if you have additional thoughts.
Can you all hear me? These just died. Is it? We're having AirPod personal problems really here. I think everything Alexis said is 1,000% point. You know,
Natalie, maybe a little.
I think
a little louder.
Another huge thing is the plan for voting. I know it sounds quite elementary, and I'm sure we're all talking to very sophisticated people, but especially given COVID and the amount of misinformation out there, just speaking to people, especially in those key states, about like how are you planning on going to a polling station? Are you planning on dropping your sort of mail-in ballot at a polling location or at your board of elections? It's, once again, not sexy, but we know psychologically that if someone just has that conversation and makes a plan, they're tremendously more likely to execute on it, and just because you have the conversation. So not to like bring us back to kindergarten and say like, okay, first you're gonna tie your shoe and do the whatever, but when it comes to things that it's important, No tactic is too rudimentary, and sometimes they're often the most impactful ones. So talk to your friends, talk to your family, get their plan, hold each other accountable in a nice way. We don't all need to yell at each other unless you're talking to me on Twitter, but you know, I think that'll be a hugely important aspect of everything.
Megan, anything else to add to that?
I was talking with a friend of mine recently who was tired of getting in Facebook arguments with people about really heated topics. And so obviously, like, talking about some of these issues could put you in that position. And I like her way of dealing with it. So I'm going to share it in case it helps anyone else, which is that, you know, rather than spending your time, you know, and as we probably all have done, where like you have a really good response and then you get up and leave to do, you know, whatever you're doing, but have to come back 3 hours later to dig in again to see if, you know, you need to get another jab. Realize like how much your time is worth and how much that time is taking up, and how much cheaper it would be to just donate $10 to your own position and like furtherance of real action towards what you need to happen. And that $10 is going to be like actually probably worth personally to you like $500 if you consider the amount of your time that you've saved by not continuing to engage in this person. That $10 can actually go towards something fruitful that's not just dealing with a troll on Facebook.
Can I?
Oh yeah, Alexis.
Oh, sorry, Alexis.
No.
I didn't mean to.
No. I
social media.
No, I get into arguments all the time with internal folks also. So I wanted to talk about what Natalie was saying about creating a plan, because I think one of the things that we saw during primary season is that polls opened at 7 a.m., but people were out online at 5 a.m., right? And we also know that mail-in ballots require stamps. They're not first-class mail. We all know what's happening with the USPS. Part of making that plan is also making sure that you vote early enough. This way you can actually go and volunteer at the polls on election day. Those people will need masks. They will need hand warmers. They're going to need someone to talk to. But more importantly, a lot of the voter suppression that we see happens at the polls. And most polling locations do have lawyers on standby. It's something that a lot of campaigns do. But you as a citizen, and I mean, as a voter, you have a right to report any type of fraudulent behavior. You also have a right to stand up for someone who is being told that they cannot vote because A, they're not registered, which in California, for example, they do same-day registration, or like their address is incorrect, or they don't have the proper identification. You can do your duty as a citizen to show up and make sure that these people are actually protected. And you know, by voting early, you can do that. But I would also say, ask your friends, to, like wherever they live, to do the same thing, because right now there's a shortage of people who are working at polling locations because they're usually elderly individuals, and because of COVID, that's not happening. We're going to have a lot of students voting for the first time who need to be energized, and they need to stay at the polling location. And you're going to have a lot of people who took off work and they're worried about like the state of affairs, and this is a very emotional experience for them. They're going to need support at the polling locations. So part of that plan is to make sure that you vote early and make sure your friends and family vote early and are informed, but also making sure that you have time to volunteer to ensure that your fellow citizens actually do have the opportunity to vote, and you can be there in case there is some type of issue or escalation, because it's coming. I do elections integrity for my global team for US 2020. It's something that we are very aware of, and we can counteract that with what's happening online with like doing actual work on the ground. So that was my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect note to end that. I just want to thank our panelists. I feel like we could continue to talk easily for another hour about these issues. And, you know, no matter how much I've, you know, been listening to talks and podcasts about these issues, I keep learning more myself. So thank you to everyone, and also want to extend a special thank you to June, who is the social media and community manager at Sava, for putting this panel together. Thank you so much, June, and thanks again to Colleen and the Battery for being a great partner with us and bringing this topic forward. I believe, June and Colleen, that this will be emailed out and with the accompanying links that we've been dropping in the chat, because there's voter guides, different organizations, ways to get involved, and our job here is to get this out and more visible. So thank you all. Colleen, I think, any closing comments?
No, I just want to say thank you again for taking the time to share this information. I personally copy and pasted so many links, so I'll get all of the ones that you all shared out along with the recording, and we will continue to spread this message far and wide. So thank you all very much, and have a great night.
Yeah, thanks.